Hi, everyone. So today we're going to do something a little bit different than I've done with prior presentations or videos, and this is actually going to be more of an educational presentation on a really complicated topic. So actually I have a little bit of a slideshow we're going to go through, and we're going to go over some difficult information. This is not something that impacts a lot of families, but when it does, it is super confusing. This is actually a request from a good friend, Sean Hart, who basically said this is something that keeps on coming up and got a lot of questions about it. I will say that what we're going to talk about today is regarding interstate cases. So this is situations where families might be living in several different states. Incredibly complicated area. Highly recommend that if you have an interstate case that comes up, you reach out to the friend of the court, as we'll talk about, if you have a support order in one state and a support order in another, so that we can work through that with you. If you have a custody issue involving multiple states, is a good reason to contact an attorney. This is not going to be legal advice. It is going to be just a general understanding of some of the lay of the land as it relates to interstate family support and interstate custody. So, going to jump right in. So, what we have is there's basically two main laws as it relates to the interstate issues that impact families. So there's the Uniform Interstate Family Support Act, and then there's the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction Enforcement Act. Those are both mouthfuls. So I'm going to say UIFSA or UCCJEA. And mostly I'm just going to try not to say either one of them because they are both mouthfuls. But there's going to be these two laws that we want to just kind of give a general overview of how they work and how they intersect with each other. So there's the two main statutes, UIFSA and UCCJEA. There are a couple other laws out there as it relates to interstate, but we're not going to talk about them. Again, this is an incredibly complicated area. Really recommend that you reach out to your friend of the court or your child support agency in your state if you have an issue come up involving this, or contact an attorney. But there are also the Hague Convention, and this involves child support involving other countries. And then there's the Full Faith and Credit Act. So there's a couple of laws out there, a lot of complicated stuff. Really just kind of want to give an overview about how this impacts families here in Genesee County and in Michigan. So the Uniform Interstate Family Support Act, again, what a mouthful. But basically the idea behind this is that there are two of these uniform laws. One is regarding support, and the other one is regarding custody, which means that support and custody and parenting time might be handled a little bit differently whenever we have families that aren't living in the same state. So that's not necessarily going to be the case, as we'll get into, but it certainly complicates issues. So here's some kind of the basic rules as it relates to UIFSA. The idea behind the support side of things is that the goal is to have one support obligation, and that's regardless of the number of states that could be involved. So if there's even families living in multiple states, the main goal is to have one support obligation. Prior to this law coming into play, it was possible and did happen where there would be a support order in more than one state at the same time. This, of course, causes all sorts of problems because of people being able to basically be double charged for child support, and that's not a good thing. So what has the UIFSA statute has basically made it so that it's much harder for there to be two states with a support order for the same child, which is an improvement from over what it used to be. To do that, there's a few different things that the statute includes that basically makes this possible. One is long-arm jurisdiction, which we will talk about. Another is continuing exclusive jurisdiction, and we're going to talk about that because that is one of the main ways that Uniform Interstate Family Support Act is used, and is a really common situation that happens for families who have friend of the court cases in Genesee County. So the first idea is long-arm jurisdiction, which is basically a situation where if there's enough contacts with the other state, then with the state of Michigan, we can reach into that state. So basically, have you lived here in the past? Was the child born here? Was the child conceived here? Basically, a few different ways of basically saying that the parents who are involved in this case had significant contacts with the state of Michigan. So the state of Michigan can then can continue their action by reaching into the other state. So that's basically what long-arm jurisdiction provides, and so got Mr. Fantastic here pointing that out for us. When we do in any sort of long-arm jurisdiction, that's not really an interstate case, but as we're going to get into, there's going to be reasons why long-arm jurisdiction is not going to work. Continuing exclusive jurisdiction is that main reason, and this is really the most important thing for people to understand as it relates to Family Support Act, Uniform Interstate Family Support Act. So when we're talking about interstate cases, families living in multiple states, and there being a child support order, this is really the most important provision. And here's how it works. Once one state enters a support order, it's the only state that's allowed to modify that support order so long as a party or a child remains in that state. So what happens is that mom, dad, and child are all living in one state, and the child is born there, and a support order is entered for that child in this state. And then dad and the child move to another state. And when that happens, a lot of people might say, well, this is now an interstate case. But if mom still resides or lives in the state of Michigan, then it doesn't become an interstate case because Michigan still has jurisdiction to modify that support order. Jurisdiction meaning they have the power and authority to be able to do that. So because somebody still lives here, they still have the state still has jurisdiction or the authority or the power to modify that support order. Now, what happens if everybody leaves? Well, that's when it changes. So until everyone leaves the state where the order was entered, the state where the initial order was entered is the only state in the country to modify that order. Remember, the goal here is to make it so there's not multiple states with multiple child support orders at the exact same time. How do you prevent that? By saying, hey, once one state is entered an order, unless everybody leaves that state continues to have the ability to modify that order, and nobody else gets to enter an order in that situation. If all the parties and the child leave the state where the initial order was entered, then that state does lose the ability to modify the order. They've lost their continuing exclusive jurisdiction unless the parties, the mom and the dad, the parents of that child say, actually, you know what, we both moved to Georgia, but we're okay with Michigan continuing to have jurisdiction or authority to change the child support order or modify the child support order. If the parties or the parents don't consent to this happening, then the original order, meaning in this scenario, the Michigan order, is going to need to be registered through the friend of the court or the child support agency to a new state. And that new state will then change that child support order or modify that child support order. When they do, this new state that has one of the parties living in it or the child living in it is going to become the state who has the ability to modify this order. You'll notice that all of the stuff that we're talking about is about who has the ability to change the child support order. We're not talking about who has the ability to enforce that child support order, because that's a different issue entirely. So there's two different things that happen when it comes to support orders, is who has the ability to change that order or enter an order, and who has the ability to enforce that order. So what we're talking about here with continuing exclusive jurisdiction is all about who has the ability to modify or change that support order. Here's an example of how this works. The CP, NCP, and child, so mom, dad, and child reside in Illinois, and Illinois enters a support order for the non-custodial parent to pay child support. In this situation, Illinois has the continuing exclusive jurisdiction, meaning that they have the ability to modify that support order. The non-custodial parent, who does not have the child in their primary care, moves to the state of Michigan. But because the custodial parent and the child still live in Illinois, they still have continuing exclusive jurisdiction, meaning that although the non-custodial parent has left the state of Illinois, Illinois still has the authority and power to change that support order. If the custodial parent and the child move to Ohio, now Illinois doesn't have anyone living there anymore, and they've lost continuing exclusive jurisdiction, meaning that they no longer have the authority or power to change that support order. So what happens is the custodial parent requests modification of the support order, and the parties don't consent to Illinois keeping the jurisdiction or keeping the ability to change that court order. So what happens is Ohio, through their child support office, registers the Illinois order for modification in Michigan because that's where the non-custodial parent lives. And then Michigan would then modify that order, and then at that point, Michigan has continuing exclusive jurisdiction now. So obviously, this fact pattern is pretty complicated. There's a lot of different things happening. But what the point of this is that not that everybody needs to understand what's going on here, but that it's a little bit more complicated than the way a normal case would happen in the state of Michigan, where everybody just lives in the state of Michigan. It gets more complicated. And that's one of the things that is the really big takeaway that I want people to have, is not necessarily that you're going to be able to figure out exactly what is going to happen in an interstate case, because you're going to work with your friend of the court office or your child support agency in your state. If you have this come up, you're not going to be handling it on your own. You're going to be getting support from the child support program. What's important to know, though, is that that's where you need to go if you need help with something like this, because it is going to be very complicated to try to do this on your own, and it's not something that's recommended to try to handle something this complicated on your own. Now, that was all about child support modification. There's also registration for enforcement. So this is basically that in the situation where somebody who owes support, is the payer of support, has left the state where that order was entered. So let's use Michigan. Michigan has a child support order, and the payer, the person who's supposed to be paying support, has left the state of Michigan. And what can happen is that the Michigan court can continue to enforce that order. If there's an income withholding in place, that's going to work out just fine. We can issue an income withholding order, take money out of the paycheck on a regular basis to pay that support, no problem. But what happens when it becomes difficult for one reason or another to be able to enforce that order or get collections or regular collections on that order? Then what happens in that situation is that order, the Michigan order that we're having difficulty enforcing, we could ask the other state to enforce that order for us. So what can happen there is that we can register that order in the other state, in the state where the non-custodial parent or payer lives, and then they'll be able to enforce it. When that happens, that state is going to be using its enforcement laws and remedies, not Michigan's laws and remedies. But at the same time, the other state is not going to be able to change the amount of support, nor are they going to be able to change how long that support goes. So in Michigan, child support goes until 18 or 19 and a half if the child is attending school full time. And that's how long support is going to continue to go, even though the other state might not have laws to that same effect. So that's kind of how that works when it comes to enforcement. And again, it's not something that anybody would need to do on their own. The Child Support Office, the Genesee County Friend of the Court here in Genesee County, would be involved with helping that family get that order registered in the other state if that's what needed to happen. But just like how we can register our orders into other states can also register their orders in the state of Michigan. They could register an order for enforcement. So they have an order in Illinois, for example, and we have the payer of support here. So other states could then ask for us to enforce that order, which certainly does happen. When we do that, we use our enforcement remedies because we're the ones who are enforcing, and we use the laws in the state of Michigan as it relates to enforcement. So, but we have to follow that other state's duration of support and amount of support. So it could be a situation where another state might have a higher support order than we would have in our state, but we're not allowed to change that order because we have to follow the order that exists in the other state. And if anybody wants that support order to be changed, they have to go to that state to request a change in that support order because somebody still lives in that state, and that state hasn't lost the ability to change or modify that support order. The other major statute, a major law that is involving interstate is regarding child custody. And so this is the Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction and Enforcement Act, which also includes parenting time. Every state in the country has some version of the Child Custody Jurisdiction Enforcement Act, just like every state has some version of the Uniform Interstate Family Support Act. The friend of the court does not get involved in these issues, but a lot of times a family that has child custody jurisdiction enforcement action issues also has family support action issues. So a lot of times the friend of the court will be kind of involved in some fashion on these cases. The Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction Enforcement Act determines which state has jurisdiction to address custody and parenting time and how that can be modified and enforced. What can become really confusing for a lot of families is that one state might have the jurisdiction or power or authority to change child support, but they may not be that may not be the same state that has the ability or authority to modify custody and parenting time. So this can get really confusing. So let's see how that works. The interstate custody jurisdiction or authority to modify child custody issues or parenting time issues is a little bit different. If one state issued a custody or parenting time order, so in another state, for example, then Michigan cannot, unless everyone left the original state, modify that. That's a lot like how the controlling exclusive jurisdiction for support works. So it seems like this should be the same rules, but it's not. The rules are a little bit different. If no state has issued a custody order, then the state that can enter that order is the home state of the child. And the home state of the child is determined by where the child has lived for the last 6 months. So now we've already added in a completely different element here about what the home state of the child is and where the right place the state is to be able to enter that support order. Once a state has issued a custody order or entered a custody order, that state retains jurisdiction or power or authority until all parties and children have left the original state. So that's kind of like the support piece. If all parents and parties or parents and the child left the original state, a new state can modify if it's the home state. So when we talked about support, there has to be a request for the other state to go ahead and modify when there's no longer a jurisdiction or authority. But this is completely different because in this situation, it's going to be based on what the home state of the child is. So let's look at how that kind of plays together. It's not always going to be one state that has jurisdiction for both issues because they're two different issues and there's two different laws, so it can get kind of complicated. And again, as I talked about already, if you have a family support UISFA issue, a Uniform Interstate Family Support Act issue, you should be talking to your child support agency in your county or in your state. If you have a custody dispute involving multiple states, really is a situation that where you're going to want to consult an attorney or do a fair amount of work looking into the laws as it relates to Child Custody Enforcement Act if you're going to proceed as your own attorney. So let's use this example. We've got a situation where the custodial parent, the non-custodial parent, and the child reside in Michigan, and there's an order entered for support and custody. So right now, this looks like your average run-of-the-mill Michigan case. There's an order, maybe this is a divorce order, or it could be an order that came from the prosecuting attorney's office for support and custody. But ultimately, there's already an order in place in Michigan. At this point, Michigan has the jurisdiction or the authority or the power to address support and custody for that family. Now, the custodial parent or the payee and the child move to Ohio, and the non-custodial parent moves to Indiana. Okay? In this situation, everybody has left the state of Michigan. So we know that everybody's left the state of Michigan. So Michigan has lost jurisdiction to modify support because they are not going to be present. Okay? Nobody's in the state of Michigan, so there's no ability to modify support or to modify custody because nobody's there. Now, let's say 6 months pass. Why 6 months? Because that's the amount of time that it takes for a child's state to become their home state. How long where they've lived for the last 6 months. So let's say the custodial parent, the payee, requests to modify support. When that happens, they're going to go to their Michigan Child Support Office and request for a modification of support, saying, hey, we want support to be changed. When they do that, they're going to Michigan, the friend of the court in this situation, is going to register that order in Indiana for modification. Why Indiana? Because that's the state where the non-custodial parent resides, and it's always the opposite state of whoever requested it. So the custodial parent is in Ohio, so we go to the opposite state, which is Indiana, and that's who's going to modify the support order. If NCP, the non-custodial parent, wants to address custody, where are they going to file their action? They're going to have to file that action in Ohio because that's where the child has lived for the last 6 months. So you can see that this gets pretty complicated. Again, really, this is a situation you don't want to try to go it alone without doing a lot of research on your own about how you're going to do it. A very important situation, very complicated situation, something that you're usually going to want to reach out to an attorney, and you certainly, if you're dealing with the child support piece, you're going to want to reach out to your child support agency or your friend of the court, because what you can end up with is these really odd situations where multiple states are involved, and it's not necessarily the state that you think should be the one that's going to be involved. So let's put it all together. Uniform Interstate Family Support Act is for support situations. The Uniform Child Custody Jurisdiction Enforcement Act is for custody and parenting time. With UFSO, we only want there to be one support obligation at a time, and we only want one state to be entering that support order. So we really try to find ways to make sure that the states are communicating to make sure that there's only one support order and there's not multiple support orders for one child. At the friend of the court side of things, we have intergovernmental indicators showing us what's going on with other states. That's why it's really important to make sure that you reach out to your friend of the court or your local office if you're talking about multiple states being involved in child support, because we have access to information from other states that many parents might not have access to. And so it's very important that we make sure that you're reaching out to the friend of the court or the child support office to make sure that we can check in with that other state and see what's going on in that other state. We have a local office chart that explains all of these issues for all of our staff. So it's important that you reach out to our office, because we're going to be able to field a lot of these questions as it relates to the Uniform Interstate Family Support Act. It's something that we deal with on a regular basis and is not commonly dealt with elsewhere. So it's very important to do that. And what we talk about is that sometimes families will come to us and they'll think that registering an order in another state for enforcement sounds like a good idea. In fact, we get a lot of requests for that, and we'll say, well, maybe that sounds like that's going to work better. But it's not as effective as a lot of families think, and more often than not, you're better off keeping your order being enforced by the state of Michigan and not having that order enforced by another state. Once another state takes it over, they're going to enforce it the way they want to enforce it, and the state of Michigan then loses control over them. It works in some situations. It doesn't work in every situation. It's a common request from parents, and we want to kind of recognize that that's not going to work for every single family. Okay, as promised, we went over a lot of different issues there. pretty complicated stuff. I totally understand that it's a complicated area, but when Sean Hart, Mr. Involved Dad, says, hey, could you give me a little bit of a better explanation about what happens with these interstate cases? And I could say, hey, that's its a whole presentation all on its own. We wanted to make sure that we honored that request and made sure to make that information available for families that we serve. Please, if you do have an Interstate Family Support Act issue, please reach out to the Genesee County Friend of the Court so that we can help guide you through that process. We have very skilled, very expert staff members who all day, every day are working with other states to go over Family Support Act issues and dealing with child support issues involving other states. We have the staff here to help out with those types of unique issues, and that's what they're here to do. So please reach out to us so that we can guide you through that process or connect you with the right resource in the right state for you to be able to get those issues resolved. If you've got Child Custody Act issues, then it's really important that you consult with an attorney or do a lot of research, because those are very complicated areas of the law and not something that you want to tread lightly into, because it can get very complicated very quickly. And most of the time, if there's child custody issues, there are also going to be support issues. And again, reaching out to the friend of the court is the right place to be. If you have any of these questions that come up or are needing assistance with Uniform Interstate Family Support Act issues or interstate cases involving multiple states, please reach out to the Genesee County Friend of the Court. We're here to serve.